Okay, let's get started. We have a lot of ground to cover this morning. Unfortunately, we're going to start with a piece of sad news this morning. Marvin Minsky, one of the founding fathers of artificial intelligence, passed away yesterday. I added this obituary to the schedule. I highly recommend you read through and learn a little bit about the life of Professor Minsky. By a strange coincidence, the thing that Marvin is most famous for, we're actually going to talk about today when we get to Lecture 4 and talk about artificial neural networks. And we're going to start our discussion about artificial neural networks today with a simple kind of artificial neural network called perceptrons, which is one of the things that made Professor Minsky very famous. We also mentioned his name last time when we were talking about the history of AI. Where did Professor Minsky's name come up in our discussion last week?
The Dartmouth Conference?
The Dartmouth Conference. So he was actually at the Dartmouth Conference back in 1956, 60 years ago, when AI actually got started. So he was there at the beginning, and we're sad to see him pass today. Okay, we will come back to Professor Minsky and some of his work a little bit later this morning. Let's have a look at the schedule. Assignment 1 was due last night at midnight. Did everyone get everything submitted to Reddit and to Blackboard? Any hiccups along the way? No? Okay. So, yes?
I may have forgotten to put it on Blackboard.
You may have forgotten to put it on Blackboard. All right. If that's good, we have a record of it being submitted. Submit it to Blackboard, send myself and the TA an email, and we'll deal with that. Okay. This week now, you're going to be working on assignments 2 and 3. So this is one of the 2 weeks in the course where we're going to double up on assignments. As I mentioned before, the reason that we're doing that is to try and give you a little bit more time at the end of the semester to work on your final project. So as you're slogging through 2 and 3 this week, remember there's a reason you're doing so. Okay, as I promised, every Tuesday morning I will talk a little bit about the new assignments for this week. I'm going to postpone that discussion a little bit. I want to get through Lecture 3 first. It's a little bit of a shorter lecture, and then we'll get into artificial neural networks, which is what you're going to be doing in assignments 2 and 3. You're going to be building and then evolving your first neural network. So I want to get through that, talk a little bit about what ANNs are first before discussing the assignments. Okay. All right, so let's just go back for a moment to the last slide from last week's lecture, which was our crash course history in AI. And I made this little cartoon here to try and touch on all the different branches of AI and robotics that have arisen in the last 60 years. And I ended last time by dividing all these different subdisciplines into 2 groups. Those that take a non-embodied approach to understanding intelligence, and those that take an embodied approach to intelligence. And we're going to talk exactly today about what we actually mean when we talk about embodied versus non-embodied systems. Okay, so onward to Lecture 3. And what we're going to do in Lecture 3 here is we're going to look at a number of the building blocks of intelligence. So if you are conversing with a Turing, or you're conversing with a machine that's trying to pass the Turing test, or you're interacting with a robot, what are the kinds of things you're going to want to see from that program or that robot to say, yes, this machine is intelligent or is at least on the path to becoming intelligent? We could argue about what are the building blocks and what aren't, but we're going to start with some that are pretty obvious and I think are going to be necessary parts of making machines that are intelligent. So we're going to look at some of these building blocks, and then we're going to look at some approaches to trying to solve or instantiate that building block in a machine, and we're going to look at disembodied approaches and embodied approaches. So to contrast the different approaches and how they attack different building blocks of intelligence. Let's start with one that most of us would argue an intelligent machine must have, which is pattern recognition, right? As I look around this room, there are a whole bunch of photons that are falling on my retina, and somehow my brain translates the signals coming from those photons into students' faces and laptops and desks and chairs and doors and so on. How do we actually do that? Back in 1956, they thought it would take a couple weeks to figure this out. It turns out it took about 60 years, and it's only just in the last year or maybe 2 years that we've started to make significant progress on this problem using different methods. So why is it so difficult? Well, let's even start with a simpler part of pattern recognition, which is known as the image segmentation problem in computer vision, which is I give you a photograph and all the computer needs to do is label pixels which are in the foreground and pixels that are in the background. Turns out it is an extremely difficult thing to do. Hopefully most of you did it instantaneously the moment you saw this slide. Not only did you perform the image segmentation problem, but you also did pattern recognition and realized there's a human in this picture and there's a particular human in this picture, which is, who is? Okay, good. Just checking. Okay, so since the 1970s or so, there have been non-embodied approaches to this, where you take a photograph of Marilyn Monroe, or a whole bunch of photographs that contain people, and a whole bunch of photographs that do not contain people, put those as input into a computer program, and it should tag those images as this is an image that contains a human, or this is an image that does not. And using deep belief networks, which we talked about very briefly last time, people have started to make progress on this problem, right? When you hold up your camera, it puts a rectangle around the faces that are in its visual field. So we've made some progress. Let's look at an embodied approach to the exact same problem. Now, instead of a computer program that takes photographs as input, we now have a robot which has a body, and the robot can use its body to push against the world and observe how the world pushes back. So we're going to, in all the embodied approaches, you're going to see this feedback loop where you have something that acts. It may be a human, it may be an animal, it may be a robot. It acts and observes the sensory repercussion of that action. What happened when I did something? And the result of that feedback loop becomes the raw material for the building blocks of intelligence, in this case, pattern recognition. Okay, this is BabyBot, built at the MIT AI lab that was founded by Marvin Minsky. This is work carried out in the late 90s, early 2000s. This was BabyBot, and it was named BabyBot because it was supposed to simulate some of the aspects of human development from infants to humans. BabyBot, as you can see in the cartoon here, has 2 eyes or 2 cameras. It uses those cameras not to construct a 3D scene that's in front of it, but instead what BabyBot does is to use those 2 video feeds that are coming in through the 2 cameras to figure out which pixels in the combined field are either signaling motion or non-motion. So the only thing BabyBot is trying to do with its 2 cameras is figure out what in front of it is moving and what isn't moving. So the images on your right there, the grayed out sections are those parts of BabyBot's vision for which it sees no motion. And the things that are opaque or in the foreground, so to speak, are things for which BabyBot has recognized motion. So BabyBot has its 2 cameras. The other sensors that it has is that it has strain gauges in its arm so it can feel when its arm is moving. Those are the only 2 sensors that this robot has. And the only 2 motors that we're going to care about today are just the motors that cause the arm to do this. Okay. So those are the sensors that the robot has, the motors that the robot has. Other than that, it has very, very little knowledge of the world. Let's say we put a whole bunch of fruit in front of BabyBot, and BabyBot doesn't know anything about the world, but it knows that it has a body, so if it's going to learn about the world, it's going to act first. So it starts to send commands to its arm, and the moment it sends commands to the arm, the strain gauges start to report weight or strain, or it doesn't really matter. So it can feel the fact that its arm is moving. the moment it does that, it sees in the top right image here this hand-shaped blob show up. BabyBot doesn't know that it has a hand. All it knows is that if I send commands to the motors, suddenly there's this blob that starts moving in my visual field. There's our first action-reaction feedback loop. What can BabyBot conclude from that sensory repercussion? A little, but not too much. Yep.
It can send commands to move things.
It can send commands
This particular thing.
That's it, right? So if I send commands to my motors, I can feel strain. Immediately there's strain on my arm, so I'm assuming that that means movement, right? Something is happening. What else can it deduce aside from that?
That something will move.
Something will move, right? So this is almost going back to Descartes last week, right? What is moving? It sees this blob.
Not it.
What's that?
Not it.
Not it, well, okay, maybe not it in the sense of what's up here, right? But this hand-shaped blob, whenever I send commands, this blob shows up. It enters my field of view, and it seems to have more or less the same shape. The moment I stop sending commands to the motors, what does BabyBot see? Given what I've told you so far about how BabyBot sees. Nothing, right? Suddenly this blob of movement disappears, and assuming nothing else is moving in its visual field, everything here goes gray. The blob disappears. It starts moving its hand again, the blob instantly reappears, disappears whenever it stops moving. So the BabyBot understands there's this thing out there, this blob, and maybe it deduces it's me, or at least it's something that I can control. And I know something about this blob. What does BabyBot know about this blob?
You can see it when he has the strain over there.
It corresponds with strain in the arm, right? I feel the strain and I see this blob. There's a relationship between what I feel and what I see. Okay, so BabyBot says, all right, there's this blob that I can make appear by sending commands to the motors, and it's playing around with its arm. It's exploring what its body can do, not unlike what babies spend most of their time doing in their first years of life. It's playing around with its arm swings back into view, and now suddenly the blob gets a lot bigger. BabyBot hasn't seen this before. BabyBot suddenly sees that this blob gets bigger, and BabyBot stops sending commands to the motors. What happens?
Goes gray.
It goes gray. The blob goes gray. Does all of this new blob go gray?
No.
No? Why not?
It might be rolling around.
It might be rolling around. It depends on how hard it hits the apple, right? Let's assume it hits it with sufficient velocity that the moment BabyBot stops moving its hand, the apple keeps rolling, so this blob keeps moving. So now BabyBot says, oh, wait a second, there's actually two blobs, or there's two things out there in the world. From BabyBot's point of view, what's the difference between these two things?
One shows up when the arm is moved and one doesn't.
Absolutely, right? So at this point, BabyBot, depending on how it's programmed, might start to distinguish different kinds of patterns in its environment, and we move from one building block of intelligence, which is pattern recognition, to a different building block, which is categorization. There's certain blobs that I can make appear or disappear based on how I move my arms, or I send commands to my motors. I'm going to call those things me, or parts of me. There are other things that maybe I can cause to happen. There are other blobs out there that are less under my control. Some of them move even when I stop moving, and some of them don't move even when I'm moving. I'm going to call all that stuff out there the world, or parts of the world. So in this cartoon example here, BabyBot has already tackled one of the biggest problems that human babies experience in the first few years of life, which is self and non-self distinction, right? Where do I end and where does the world begin?
It seems like all of these fit together really, really closely. Like pattern recognition, you need categorization for that, and then maybe for categorization you need some way of labeling, like
Right. We're going to
how do you
treat.
tackle one of these without just getting into all of them?
That's true, exactly. All the building blocks of intelligence hang together in important ways. And for the purposes of our discussion today, we're going to treat them as separate things, but obviously they are not separate things. Okay, so you get the idea. Let's say we allow BabyBot to keep moving around its arms in larger arcs and at slower, faster speeds, and it bumps into these different objects. What more can BabyBot learn about these things that are out there in the world? And think about these particular things here. You can learn about shape, right? So things that are like this, that are sort of, let's call this round. From BabyBot's point of view, it comes up with a word. It says I'm going to call these things round because it has this particular kind of shape. But it's not just the shape. It starts to associate things with shape, such as rolling, right? So if I hit something and this kind of blob appears, if I've sent enough power to the motors, this thing will go like this in my visual field. I'm going to call that rolling. Things that tend to have that shape tend to have that property. What else can it learn?
Maybe the weight of objects or something with the stress meter when it's
Absolutely, right? So there's some things that start moving when I just tap them, and there are other things that only start moving when I really slam into them. There must be some property, and I'm going to call that thing weight or mass, right? And it might be harder for me to guess what the mass of something is by just seeing what the shape of the blob is. But maybe I can start to figure it out. The other advantage that BabyBot has over the disembodied approaches where you just feed in photographs is it gets image segmentation for free, right? It doesn't have to find the edge of the apple. By touching the apple and looking for motion and non-motion, it automatically sees the outline of the object. It immediately gets shape for free, and it easily starts to be able to associate shape with the other properties. Okay, that's BabyBot. There's lots more that it's a nice exercise to actually sit down with this slide and think through what else could BabyBot learn about apples and bananas and oranges and grapes and toy cars and books and whatever else we put in front of it, just by the fact that BabyBot is embodied and can interact with those objects and observe the repercussions of those actions. Let's go back for a moment to disembodied approaches where we feed in thousands or millions, or these days billions of photographs to a deep belief network, and it learns to recognize Marilyn Monroe or fruit or what have you. Let's say we train up our deep belief network to recognize images that contain bananas and those that do not. Does the deep belief network understand, quote unquote, bananas in the same way that BabyBot understands bananas? No. Why not? It has no way to interact with the body, and by interacting with the object, BabyBot can learn things about bananas that would be exceedingly difficult for a deep network to learn just by being fed lots of photographs that contain bananas and that do not. Doesn't mean that it's impossible for a neural network to learn that. There might be enough information in enough pictures of bananas to actually figure out everything that BabyBot can learn about bananas. But I think this points up the important distinction between disembodied and embodied approaches. The fact that you have a body, fundamentally it's a tool, and you use it to learn about the world in fundamental ways. So this also points up this fundamental split that exists in the field of AI and robotics between those who believe in disembodied approaches as the long-term solution to understanding intelligence and those who follow the embodied track. And as you can imagine, in this class, we're going to be following the embodied approach because we're going to spend most of the time talking about how robots, machines with bodies, interact with the world to learn, to categorize, to plan, and so on. Okay, so that's pattern recognition. I just mentioned planning, another important aspect of intelligence. If you can't think about what's going to happen in the next millisecond or the next minute or the next month or the next year, you're probably people are going to consider you less intelligent than someone or something that can think further ahead. Planning was on the docket back in 1956, and actually this was one of the first building blocks to fall or to be solved by AI approaches. And it was solved most famously by the match between Kasparov and IBM's Deep Blue. Anybody remember these matches? When did they take place? In the 90s, right? So Deep Blue won its first game against Kasparov in 96, and the following year won a complete match against Kasparov. Does anybody know how Deep Blue works? Or the basics underlying it in a few sentences?
So lots of recursion, plans out every move, and then chooses the one that just has the most fortuitous outcome for it.
Absolutely. So we won't go into details today in the interest of time. For those of you that are interested in this topic, if you look up mini-max trees, this is the data structure and the approach that captures exactly what you just said, right? I do that. If I take this move, then she will take that move, and if she takes that move, then I'll take that move, and you follow those moves through a tree. You find all the worst outcomes, which in this case is I lose the game. So that's maximum punishment or maximum worst case scenario for me, and I'm going to try and minimize those branches. I'm going to try and avoid going down into those branches that ends with me losing the game. And if I successfully avoid all of those and avoid all the branches that lead to stalemate, the inevitable result is I win the game. There's a lot else that was going on in Deep Blue, but at heart there was something that looked like a minimax tree. Okay, disembodied approach, no robot here, just a computer, right? Feed in the moves and away you go. Why was it so easy to solve planning, at least for chess? Back in 1956, they thought this was one of the last things that computers were going to solve. It ended up being one of the first things.
Because there's certain moves you can do in limited space.
Absolutely, right? So there's a clearly demarcated board. There's a fixed set of moves that you can perform. When you exist in the real world, what is your set of moves, right? Much more difficult to say. Okay, so we have a very circumscribed, carefully described, controlled environment. If you have such an environment, computers do just fine. Okay, let's look at another cognitive ability here. This one's kind of in here just for fun. Now, whether you believe that an intelligent machine or organism needs free will to be intelligent, we'll set that aside for a moment. A lot of people think that you do. If you are intelligent and you want to plan and you want to act and you want to recognize there's a you in that statement somehow. It's the thing that's making the choices, right? Back to Descartes. We all have free will. It's obvious, right? I choose to do something and then I do it. No problem. There was a very controversial paper back in the 1980s that said, hold on a second, maybe this is not as straightforward as it feels like it is. This was an experiment by Libet using human subjects that were brought into the lab. They were instrumented with EEG patches. Who knows what an EEG is?
Electroencephalogram.
And what does it measure?
Brain waves.
Brain activity, brain waves, right. Mostly captures what's happening on the surface, but good enough for our purposes today. The same subjects had EEG on the scalp and EMG sensors on the finger, which measure muscle activity. What is EMG? Electromyogram. So we're recording brain activity using EEG and muscle activity using EMG. Okay. The subjects were asked to perform the following task. They were set in front of a clock, and there was a moving point of light around the circumference of the clock. They were asked to freely choose at any point in time to move their finger, and they were asked that when they made that choice to immediately twitch or contract the finger. So the finger. So I'm watching the clock. At exactly 8 seconds after the minute, I decide to move my finger. I move it, and I tell the investigator, I chose to move my finger at 8 minutes past the minute, 8 seconds past the minute. Okay, that's what they did. And they found that at the exact point in time that the subjects reported that they decided to move the finger, 200 milliseconds later, the finger actually did move. So most of the human subjects were telling the truth. They actually moved their finger when they had decided, when they had made the choice to move their finger. Turns out that 300 milliseconds before the point in time that the subjects felt that they had made their decision, there were consistent patterns that always correlated with the pattern picked up by the EEG at that point in time. Now, whatever that particular pattern was, it differed for different subjects, but it was always there 300 milliseconds before they thought they chose to move their finger. And that pattern tended not to be there at other points in time. So where, or maybe more importantly, when did the decision occur? Okay, that's the results. Now, the interpretation of the results can lead into very interesting and controversial discussions. But at least it suggests, and this is what's important for us, for our purposes, is that thinking about thinking is misleading. So one of the things that makes AI difficult is we think to ourselves, well, I'm a thinking machine, and recognizing Marilyn Monroe is trivial, so if I sit down with some code in about 2 months, I can write a program to do it. Turns out it's not as easy as we thought. And are we really sure that we know what's going on? When we introspect about our various cognitive abilities, turns out in many cases we're fundamentally flawed in our thinking. So as we go along, check your own introspection. Be careful, thinking about thinking is misleading. Did the human subjects actually decide to move their fingers at that point in time? Did their subconscious make the decision to move the finger 300 milliseconds earlier? If their subconscious made the decision, and by definition our conscious selves have relatively limited access to our subconscious, did we make the decision, or did the human subjects make the decision? Right? It kind of clouds the subject somehow. Okay, that one's kind of just for fun. Let's move back to planning. So we just talked about Deep Blue that uses a minimax tree to plan in a disembodied way. Well, of course, if you want to get around in the world, if you want to leave this room at the end of lecture, you have to plan your exit route. So there were attempts back in the late 60s and early 70s to build robots that could do this in an embodied way. And this was one of the first planning robots and one of the first robots in general, Shakey the robot, built in Stanford. Amazingly, at that time, Shakey had a lot of its computing resources on board, pretty impressive for the time. You can see it had a camera and rangefinders and so on. They would put it in the lab, put some obstacles around Shakey. Shakey would sense its immediate surroundings and then model its immediate surroundings. So these little cartoons here are obviously not Shakey or Shakey's environment, but just to give you a feel for how this works. Shakey would build up a 3D representation of its environment. It would then plan a whole bunch of alternative paths to get from its current location to a desired location, like the door to exit the room. Shakey would then move about an inch, stop, sense, model, plan, move, sense, model, plan, move, and so on. Why do you think Shakey was called Shakey the robot?
Because it spends so much time planning.
It spent so much time planning, right? So it would move a little bit and sort of shake and come to a stop and then sit there for a few minutes or a few hours, depending on how many obstacles they put in front of Shakey. It would move, stop, think, move, stop, think, and you've got Shakey the robot. Now we can't pick on Shakey too much, right? Because Shakey was using 1970s technology. But it turns out that that wasn't the only problem. So we've got much more modern technology now. You've got some pretty sophisticated hardware up here. When you leave the classroom, you don't get up, stop, plan for a couple minutes, take one step, and so on, right? So one of the problems with the early embodied approaches to AI was heavy emphasis on this side, the modeling and the planning and the thinking and building a complex environment. And while you're thinking, you're not acting, right? Our ancestors, from an evolutionary point of view, that would probably not be a pretty good strategy, especially if you're trying to escape a predator or capture prey, right? There was a lot of overemphasis on the thinking part back in the 60s and 70s, and relatively little on the movement and body part, because we are the inheritors of the Western tradition of thought, which goes back to Descartes, right? This is real, this is the important part, and all of this stuff which executes my actions, that's not so important. That's pretty easy. We'll just wrap our computers in a robot. This is the part we really need to focus on. We really need to make sure that Shakey builds up a good three-dimensional representation of its environment, and so on. So, AI researchers back in the 60s and 70s were hobbled by computer technology at that time, but they were also hobbled by the Cartesian inheritance, right? This is important, the body, not so important. Well, we can kind of add that part later. Okay. After Marvin Minsky stepped down as the director of the MIT AI lab, a later director was Rodney Brooks, who took over in the 1980s, and Rodney Brooks took over as the director of the AI lab because he was a revolutionary in the field of AI in the early 80s, and he said, look, we have to finally shake our Cartesian inheritance. It's not thinking about thinking or focusing on the brain and all the stuff the brain does and then just kind of use the body as a byproduct. It's body first. The fact that you can act on the world and sense the repercussions of that action, make sure that feedback loop is going and you're continuously moving and continuously reacting to the environment. Once you get that feedback loop down, then you can start to add more complicated aspects to that feedback loop. But that near real-time feedback loop better always be there from the beginning. That's how Mother Nature did it. She made sure the first organisms were able to react immediately to their environment, and then those organisms got complex over time, right? She didn't build thinking things that sat there and moved every once in a while. So let's follow Mother Nature's lead and make sure we get that feedback loop down. And there are lots of different ways to do that. The easiest way to explain is through Brooks's subsumption architecture. So imagine now we have a simple wheeled robot, maybe like Bratenberg's vehicles that roam around. We have a wheeled robot, and it has some obstacle sensors. And if it senses an obstacle on its left, it turns to the right. If it senses an obstacle on its right, it turns to the left. So as long as there's any obstacle there, the obstacle sensors and the behavior to avoid obstacles are going to drive the motors. But if at any time there's no obstacles there, let the next most important behavior take charge of the motors. So if there's no obstacles around, that's fine. I'll just kind of move around. But if I hear a loud noise, I will react and try and avoid the sound of the. I'll try and avoid the loud sound. So maybe if there's noise in the environment, our wheeled robot is avoiding the noise, but as it's avoiding the noise, if at any moment it now senses an obstacle, its more immediate task is to avoid obstacles. This is more important than this, so this behavior subsumes or takes over control of the motors. So we can keep stacking more and more behaviors on top of the robot's control architecture here. But no matter how many we add, it will always do the most important thing, which is not smash into obstacles and brake, because this will always subsume the motors whenever that situation arises. So now we have something that's the exact opposite of Shakey, something that's always driving around. And at any point in time, it may be doing lots of different things, but it's mostly doing the things that we want it to do, which in this case is avoid obstacles. That's the subsumption architecture. Does anybody have a Roomba vacuum cleaner at home? This is more or less exactly what your Roomba is doing. Roomba is produced by the iRobot Corporation. The CEO of iRobot is Rodney Brooks. So this idea finally made it into a practical robot, maybe the only home-based robot that's out there at the moment, or the home-based autonomous robot that's out there, which is Roomba. Okay. Other things to note about the subsumption architecture: behaviors are arranged in parallel, not serial. So maybe these things are actually happening in parallel. At any time, one can take over. That's very different from Shakey, where sensing, then modeling, then planning, then moving was sequential. Right? Our brains are not really sequential, they're parallel processors. Okay, one behavior is always in control at a time. Higher levels can subsume control of the robot at any time. Okay, so we've looked at some of the building blocks of AI, and we've looked at of intelligence. We've looked at some disembodied and embodied approaches. We've seen the differences. Now we can try and distill that down into a definition. Embodied cognition is pretty straightforward. The way you process information is affected by the fact that you have a body. Your laptop or your desktop has a body, right? It has a physical casing to it, but it's not a body in the sense that we mean, where for our purposes, a body is a tool that you can use to affect the world. Right? So yes, our laptops and our phones are physical things, but they don't have a body in the same way that a robot has a body. Okay, if you have a body in the sense that we mean it, and you can move, and you can also see, well, by see I just mean sense in general. The moment you move, you will sense the repercussion of that action, right? The moment BabyBot moved its arm, it saw this big blob of moving pixels. So if you have this body and you can sense, you can immediately set up this feedback loop. Okay. Non-embodied technologies are fundamentally passive, right? No matter how sophisticated a deep belief network is, it has to sit there and wait for us to provide enough photographs with Marilyn Monroe and without Marilyn Monroe in order to figure out how to recognize Marilyn Monroe. Robots and organisms are fundamentally active machines, right? To learn well, we act on the world, right? If there's something I'm saying that you don't understand, act. Put up your hand, ask a question, probe the world around you. Okay. Related to embodied cognition, and we're going to see this several times throughout this course, is situated cognition, which is related to embodied cognition, but it's a little bit different. The basic definition of situated cognition is just that you have sensors. You're situated in the world in the sense that when the world changes, you have sensors that pick up at least some of that change. For some robots that we're going to see, they're minimally situated, meaning their view of the world is very circumscribed. There's only a few things that they can sense. We are very sophisticated, situated agents. We have lots of sensors, and we have lots of different kinds of sensors. Okay. The moment you're a situated device, you have to, by definition, operate in real time, right? The world is not going to wait to update its state for you to be ready to record that change. You have a sensor, the sensor is on, the world is changing, you're sensing that change in real time. If it's not real time, we're back to the disembodied approach, right? A deep belief network can sense a photograph, but it does so when it's ready or when we provide it to it, right? It's passive. Okay, any embedded devices, the intelligent room sensors over in the Davis Center that turn on the lights when they detect movement, those are all systems that are situated or embedded in the world. Okay, I think the example is pretty obvious here. Okay, if we put these two things together, if we have a robot or an organism that is both embodied and situated, we're going to call it a complete agent. Complete in the sense that it has this complete feedback loop. It has a body, it's embodied, it can act on the world, and it's situated, it can sense the repercussion of that action. Okay. The moment that we have a complete agent, regardless of whether it's biological or artificial, there are certain repercussions to being both embodied and situated that you can't avoid. And actually, most of the time, you don't want to avoid it. You want to exploit that fact. Right? So if you're embodied and you're moving around in the world, you're obviously going to be subject to the laws of physics. You can't avoid that one.
but you can exploit that fact. Can you think of examples in nature where animals or humans exploit the fact that when they move, they're subject to the laws of gravity? Walking. Kind of gave that away, right? Laws of physics, laws of gravity. We're going to spend some time talking about quadrupedal locomotion and specifically bipedal locomotion, which is one of the most energy efficient modes of transportation that Mother Nature has yet discovered, right? On half a Big Mac, most of us can walk several miles. It's incredibly energy efficient, right? It happens, why is bipedal locomotion energy efficient? Well, when your leg is swinging, so the stance leg is the one that's obviously planted to the ground at that time, your swing leg is the one that's swinging. The moment your legs start swinging as you're walking, all the muscles in your legs relax and your leg acts like a pendulum. If you're walking at a relatively slow speed, you're not pushing your swing leg forward, you're letting it swing. Right? When you're running, it's a different situation. We exploit the fact that our legs have weight, and the moment you lift them from the ground and they're behind you, they will passively swing forward, thanks to physics, which can save us some energy, which obviously has advantages for us. Okay. The moment we act in the world and we're also situated, we sense the repercussions of those actions. We've already talked about a few examples. Can you think of some other examples of animals or humans that exploit the fact that the moment they do something, there's a sensory repercussion of that action? So human babies do it to learn about the world in the way that we saw with BabyBot. Other examples?
I guess the first thing that came to mind was like touching something hot and then pulling away. It's if that wasn't in real time, you would be...
You'd be in a lot of trouble,
Yeah.
absolutely, right? So I act, I wonder if this thing is hot, I touch it, I get a sensory repercussion immediately, pull my hand away. That's fine. Can we think of an example where an animal or organism exploits that feedback loop? Maybe not that feedback loop. The fact that the moment I move, something happens, and then exploit that to get something done.
Bats,
How so?
echolocation.
Absolutely, right? So bats, you have to get around in the dark. You can't see, you can't wait for photons to fall on your eyes. You're going to have to do something active. So they send out clicks or sounds, and then they sense the repercussions of those actions. And by flying around as they're doing that, they can triangulate on prey very quickly. That's a good example, right? They're exploiting that feedback loop. Yes?
And just flying in general too, right?
Flying in general, that's right, absolutely. Yeah, you flap your wings and sense changes in strain, and that helps you to fly. Obviously, there's an infinite number of examples we can imagine. Okay, the fact that we move, often we affect the environment in a lasting way. We might actually leave a literal or metaphorical imprint on the environment. Can you think of examples of organisms that exploit that fact that when they move, they leave an imprint on the environment?
Ants,
How so?
they leave pheromones when they travel away, and they use that to find their way back.
Absolutely, right? So ants and other social insects leave chemical traces in their environment called pheromones that help them do various things, like find the way back to the nest when it's hard to find the nest, or to find and mark shortest paths from nest to food source. Humans also do this, not with chemical pheromones. Next time there's a heavy snow on campus and the first student tracks through the snow across the quad, they leave an imprint, literal imprint on the environment that most students tend to follow. And we very rapidly, in a distributed manner, reestablish all the shortest paths between the major buildings on campus, right? We do this and exploit it all the time. Often we're not even aware that we're doing it. Okay, so just to finish off our lecture here on embodied and disembodied cognition, I want you to turn to your neighbor and spend just a minute or two thinking about biological systems or artificial systems that are disembodied and not situated, disembodied and situated, and so on. We've talked about some technologies that fall into some of these cells. Some of the others not so obvious. All right, take a minute or two, and then we'll see what you came up with.
This is why you're not
have sensors on this body.
That's something that doesn't directly.
I would say they would like to see
Okay, let's see if we can fill this matrix out. Let's start with the diagonal cells. They're a little bit easier. We just talked about disembodied and non-situated technologies. What are some?
Any kind of like program inside a computer.
Absolutely. So a computer program, again, depending on how we define sensing, can sense things from its input devices or through the internet, but not in the important sense that we're going to talk about it in this class, which is sensing the world directly, right? That's important. So any sort of computer program that has no direct access to sensors or motors is disembodied and non-situated. This one's situated and embodied. We are situated, we're embodied, right? So biological organisms, or at least animals. Plants, we could probably argue about that one. What else falls in that bottom right cell besides us? Robots, particular kind of robots, right? Robots that are sensing and acting on their environment. Okay. Let's try situated but disembodied. Any ideas there? Yes?
Yeah, the motion sensing lights.
The motion sensing lights, right? So over the Davis Center, they're situated, they're sensing in real time, is there movement or not in this room? But those sensors do not have a body in the important sense. Now they have limited action capabilities, right? They can turn on or off the lights in the room, but they cannot sense the repercussion of that action. They're just focused on motion, and they can turn light on and off, but they're kind of limited, right? So maybe we want to think about embodied and disembodied as not either or, but kind of a continuum, and intelligent sensors or embedded devices are pretty far down on the disembodied side of things. All right, let's do the converse, embodied but non-situated.
Our computer, they're waiting for an input, but they can't do anything without that input.
Okay, so they're sort of non-situated. We just talked about that. Computers, they have to wait for input somehow indirectly from us or their input devices or the internet. Are they embodied though? We're looking for something that has a body, not in the trivial sense of a physical casing, but something that can move or affect the environment directly.
Like an industrial machine.
An industrial machine, right? So we talked about industrial robots last week. Now, most modern industrial robots are situated, they sense the repercussions of their actions. But the first generation of industrial robots back in the 70s, they were programmed to use their body to weld the car door, but they had limited or no sensing ability to detect whether that weld succeeded or failed. But it usually succeeded because the factory was built around the industrial robot to make sure that the car door showed up exactly where and when it had to for the weld. Okay. So computers in the top left here, us in the bottom right, autonomous or situated robots in the bottom right, and I threw avatars in here as well. This is something that's often confusing when we talk about situated and embodied cognition. A situated and embodied system does not necessarily have to be physical. If we create an avatar and drop it into a virtual reality, and that virtual reality has some physics, and that avatar reaches out with its virtual arm and pushes against its virtual environment, and the avatar senses the repercussion of that virtual action in that virtual environment, it is situated and embodied. That's important for us because you're not going to be working with physical robots in this course. You're going to be working with simulated robots like you saw in some of the videos last week. Those virtual robots move, they affect their environment, so they're embodied. When they affect their virtual environment, most of them can sense the repercussion of that action. So you're going to be building situated and embodied machines. You're just going to be doing it in virtual environments. Okay, and industrial robots in the top right there, and embedded devices in the bottom left. Okay, that concludes our relatively brief discussion of embodied cognition and situated cognition. Any questions before we move on? Okay, so just back to the schedule for a few seconds here. We are now finishing our introduction to evolutionary robotics. We're going to move on quickly to 4, 5, and 6 so we can get you up to speed on the basic tools of the trade, which you're going to be implementing over the next few weeks in assignments 3 through 10. We're going to start today with artificial neural networks. The reading for today comes from the textbook. Okay, so in our lecture on artificial neural networks here, we're going to start with a familiar friend here, our Bratenberg vehicle. Which Bratenberg vehicle is this on the left? This is the aggressor, right? We'll turn towards a naked light bulb and destroy it given the opportunity. Bratenberg vehicles have probably the most simple neural networks you can imagine. And as we go forward through this lecture, we're going to start with that and start to add complexity to our very simple neural networks, which are nothing more than models of actual nervous systems. Okay, so our Bratenberg vehicle, remember, have 2 sensors in the front, 2 wheels in the back, and in the case of the aggressor over here, 2 wires that connect the left sensor to the right motor and the right sensor to the right motor. Let's take these 2 wires, so to speak, pull them out of the Bratenberg vehicle, and now throw the Bratenberg vehicle away. So here's my Cartesian inheritance showing. All right, I said don't do this, and now we're throwing the body away. Don't worry, we'll put the body back soon enough. So now we've got 2 nodes at the top, and those nodes are attached to the sensors, and they capture values from the sensors. Those are going to be our input neurons, or our sensor neurons. You'll hear me use both terms as we go along. So sensor neurons, as the name implies, capture values that are arriving from the outside world. Then we have our output neurons, or our motor neurons, which again I'll use interchangeably as we go along. The values that arrive at our output or our motor neurons are values that are going to be then turned into forces that are applied to the motors. The larger that value, the stronger the force we apply to the wheel and the faster the wheel spins. Or the more force we apply to the elbow joint or the knee joint of a robot. Okay, so we have sensor neurons, we have motor neurons, and the wires, quote unquote, that connect them together. Henceforth, we're going to talk about synapses. So synapses in nervous systems is the point at which one neuron influences the activity of another neuron. So when we draw our neural networks, we're going to represent them as an arrow. Wherever you see an arrow, that's a synapse. We have our little pluses here. Pluses represent excitatory synapses. And I don't have any on here, but if you see a negative sign, that represents an inhibitory synapse, meaning that the signal at the source neuron, or at the root of the arrow, inhibits the neuron at the head, or the arrow of the arrow. Okay, we'll see some more excitatory and inhibitory connections, or synapses, as we go along. So in the first example here, it's pretty trivial. The plus just means take the value at the input neuron and copy it into the output neuron. Pretty simple, right? But even that simple neural network gives us phototaxis in our aggressor robot. Okay, let's add some more synapses here. So let's add our two ipsilateral connections. I talked about contralateral last time. Contra across lateral the line, ipsilateral on the same line. So now we have, at each of our motor neurons, we have two incoming connections. And these incoming connections tell us visually that the value of this neuron is being influenced by the value of this neuron and this neuron. And again, the pluses here are pretty straightforward. All we do is take this value and add this value. Pretty straightforward. So we just sum the values of the incoming neurons, and that gives us the values of our motor neurons. Let's say we took this neural network and we dropped it back into a Bradenberg vehicle and we shone a light at it. What would that vehicle do?
Anytime there's light, it would drive in a straight line.
Okay, it would always drive in a straight line, right? There's no way for the values at the motor neurons to be different. It's always going to be driving forward. Does it always drive forward at the same speed? What changes its velocity? Proximity to the light, right? More light, or the closer to the light it is, the faster it'll go. The more in darkness it is, the slower it'll go. Okay, so it's just us practicing our intuition about neural networks and trying to think through what would be the embodied repercussion of that neural network. Okay. Let's now throw away our pluses and minuses, and now we're going to label our synapses with synaptic weights. So a weight, as the name implies, is the weight of the influence of the source neuron on the target neuron. So a weight of 0, in essence, means that this neuron has no influence on the neuron to which it's attached. The further this number diverges from 0, the more negative it is or the more positive it is, the more influence the incoming neuron has on the outgoing neuron. So far, so good. So the more negative a synaptic weight is, the more inhibitory the source neuron is on the target neuron. The more positive a synaptic weight is, the more excitatory the source neuron is on the target neuron. So far, so good? Okay, but remember that again, any given output neuron so far in our picture has two influences. So how do we reconcile this weight and this value and this weight and this value? We do so by multiplying the value of the input neuron times the weight of the connecting synapse and adding it to this value times this value, right? Just written out here for you. So if these two input neurons were 0, what would be the value of the output neuron? 0, right? It doesn't matter what these weights are. They have influence, but the moment those sensors are dormant, right? They're off. They're not affecting this output neuron here. The moment these input neurons are non-zero, they start to affect the output neuron. And their relative contribution to the output depends on their weight. Okay, so our neural networks are going to get more complicated, and the equations that we're eventually going to write down to describe those neural networks are going to get more complicated. But in all of the equations that you're going to see in this course, at their heart, you're going to see somewhere in that equation, if you can't find it, you have to go back and try and figure out that equation better. Somewhere in that equation there will be this times this plus this times this. You'll see multiplications summed together, which is indicating that any given neuron is influenced by other neurons, and it's influenced by more or less. All right, if we look at this output neuron for a moment, same deal, this value times this plus this value times this. We'll see that, you can see in this case now, this output neuron is excited by this neuron, but it's also inhibited by this neuron. With an inhibitory connection, these two weights have the same magnitude. Yes?
Do we use output neurons that have fixed values, or do they always just start at 0?
They do not start at any value. We turn on our robot. The moment we turn it on, its sensors fire up. The sensors register values. We take those values, we compute the output values using our multiplication and then summation. And now we take those values and we send them to the motors.
Okay.
Right? We send those values to the motors. Our robot moves. What happens the moment it moves?
Values change for the input.
Which values change?
All.
All of the, in this simple case, all the sensor neurons change, right? So our Bradenberg vehicles, even though they're agonizingly simple, they are both situated and embodied. Right? They move, and the moment they move, their sensor values change, which means their motor outputs change, and they start moving around and they react to their environment. Different environments, and they're going to react in different ways. Right? That's the heart of adaptive behavior, and most of the adaptive machines we're going to see in this course have inside them some version of this process. So far, so good? Okay, let's go back to this output neuron for a moment. Let's look at the influences here, inhibitory and excitatory, but they're equal magnitude. If the sensors register the same value, what arrives at the output layer? What value do we get? 0, right? So they basically cancel each other out. If this one is firing more strongly than this one is inhibiting this one more than this one is exciting this one, what's the value at the output neuron? Negative. It's negative, right? So the inhibitor is winning out over the excitator. If there's stronger value here than here, what's the value here? Positive. Okay, so I think you get the intuition now for how neural networks work. They're a huge collection of neurons. Those neurons are connected together with inhibitory and excitatory connections, and depending on this distribution and magnitude of those inhibitory and excitatory connections, they influence more or less, the neurons influence more or less each other differently at different times, depending on the input. Okay, we've got an issue here, though, which is, let's imagine that our motors can only receive forces between 0 and 1. Don't worry about the units for a moment. We've summed the output neurons, and some of them are above 1. We would like to squash the values of our output neurons back to values between 0 and 1, or the desired range for our motors. So once we've performed this summation, we're going to then apply an activation function to this summation, which is some kind of function that squashes the value back to some desired range. As we go along, you'll see different kinds of activation functions. And to think about these activation functions, the horizontal axis here represents the total negative or positive raw value arriving at the output neuron. We then go along to that raw value and we go up to find what is the normalized value. We delete the raw value and put the normalized value back in here. So if we apply an activation function that's squashing values to the range of 0 to 1, this one falls between 0 and 1, so no squashing required. Just leave the 0.09. This value is above 1, so squash it, and it ends up being 1. We delete 1.29 and put 1 back in there. So for each one of our output neurons, there's two actions we need to perform. We need to do this summation to get the raw value, and then supply it to our activation function to squash it between 0 and 1. In assignments 2 and 3 this week, you're going to be using just threshold logic, so leave the value alone if it's between 0 and 1. If it's above 1, replace that value with a 1. If the summation is below 0, replace it with a 0. You can use the step function. We might use others later on. Okay, so far so good? All right, I am going to pause at this point. We're going to now talk about assignments 2 and 3, where you're going to be implementing exactly these things. Okay, this is assignment 2. I'm just going to talk you through the screenshots. As I mentioned before, the screenshots are there to help you debug your code visually. The first of the 5 screenshots that you're going to be creating for assignment 2, you're going to be creating a neural network that has 10 neurons in it. The neural networks that I just talked about had 2 layers, 2 at the input layer and 2 at the output layer. You're not going to have any layers yet. You're just going to have 10 neurons. And then you'll see that you have 10 by drawing them, first of all. Then you're going to draw this picture. What do the lines represent in this picture? The synapses. We're going to connect every neuron to every other neuron, which is represented by the lines. One of the students last year realized that there are actually a few synapses that are not drawn in this picture. What are they? We're connecting every neuron to every neuron. What's missing here?
The neurons to themselves.
The neurons to themselves, right? So we're going to connect every neuron to every other neuron plus each neuron to itself. So there's 10 synapses here that are missing, and we'll talk next time about what those self connections actually do. They're extremely important. The next picture, you now see that you have a collection of black and gray lines. What do you think the black and the gray represents? Inhibitory, that's right. So in this random neural network that I've created, some of the synapses that I've created randomly are excitatory, the ones in black. The ones that are in gray are inhibitory. You're going to be storing your synapses in a matrix. So in this class in Python, you're going to be doing a lot of array and matrix manipulations in NumPy. You've already been exposed to NumPy in assignment 1. If you're not comfortable with vector and matrix operations in NumPy, go do an online tutorial about that. Okay, you're going to be storing these synaptic weights in a weight matrix. I'll just call it W for our purposes. What do you think the size of this matrix is going to be if we're going to store all our synapses? 10. 10 by 10, right? 10 rows, 10 columns. So any element ij in this element, so we're going to go down to the ith row and then across to the jth column. We'll find a single number in there. That number is going to represent the synaptic weight that connects neuron I to neuron j. What are the values that fall along the diagonal of this matrix? What do they represent? The connections to itself, right? EII represents the synaptic weight that connects neuron I to neuron I. So far, so good? So we're storing those values in a matrix, and then you're visualizing them in a screenshot. And if you visualize it in a screenshot and you saw all black lines, there's a problem somewhere, right? Either the bug is in your visualizer, or when you initialize this matrix, you only initialized it with positive values, not a random mixture of positive and negative values. This is how you use these images to debug your code. Okay, assuming you get a picture that has a collection of black and gray lines, it doesn't have to be exactly the same collection that I have because we're generating this randomly, but you should see a more or less even distribution of black and gray. Now you're drawing these lines with different widths. What do you think the width of the line represents? The weight itself, right? So a thick black line means what? A stronger positive weight. A thin gray line, like you see here, represents what? A weak inhibitory connection, right? So far we've been talking about inhibitory and excitatory connections. They can also be weak or strong, right?
Are the connections undirected?
They are not, they are directed here. So if you look carefully, let's look along the vertical here. You can see there's a thick black line, and then drawn on top of that thick black line is a thinner gray line. You cannot tell from this image which one is pointing to which, but they're both there, right? One of these is the one that points from I to J, and the other one is the edge that points from J to I. So you can have neurons that mutually influence one another, which is also kind of interesting, and we'll see one of the things that you can get out of that interaction, but not today. Okay, so that's a representation. The first four images here are a representation of the fact that you've made your W matrix here, your matrix of synaptic weights correctly. The fifth and final image that you see here, this is going to be a second matrix, which represents the values of the neurons. I think it's called neuron values in the assignment. I'll just call it N for now. And this one is a 10 by 50 matrix, so 50 rows and 10 columns. The values in the first row, these are the values of the 10 neurons at the first time step. So we're going to set those neurons to random values between 0 and 1. So again, this is something to keep in mind. For our purposes, neurons are going to range between 0 and 1. But our synaptic weights are going to range between -1 and +1 because we want inhibitory and excitatory connections. One of the easiest ways to go wrong in assignments 2 and 3 is to get your neurons and synapses confused. So make sure as you're going through you understand what the synapses are doing and what the neurons are doing. Okay, so we don't have a robot yet. We have a disembodied neural network. So we have no sensors. We have no way to get information from the outside world. So we just start by setting all 10 neurons to random values. We take the value of the first neuron, multiply it by the weight that connects the first neuron to the second neuron, then take the value of the first neuron, multiply it by the synapse that connects it to the third neuron, and so on and so on. How many multiplications are we doing for neuron 1? How many neurons influence neuron 1? Counting itself. Counting itself, there are?
Well, wait, what am I saying? 10.
10. I'm sorry, I misspoke. So we're actually looking at all of the neurons that influence neuron 1. We want to calculate, we have the value for neuron 1 at the first time step, which I'll call T0. We have 10 neurons that connect to neuron 1. We take the value of that neuron itself, multiply it by the synapse connecting 1 to 1. Take the value of neuron 2, multiply it by the weight of the synapse that connects 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 4 to 1, 5 to 1, and all the way through 10 to 1. So we do multiplication 10 times. We sum all those things together. We put them through our activation function, which gives us back a new value for neuron 1 that ranges between 0 and 1. Now we go to neuron 2. We look at all of the 10 incoming connections to neuron 2, do our 10 multiplications, take that, push it through our activation function. we get the new value of neuron 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, again, and so on for 50 time steps. So far, so good? Okay. What you see then in the fifth picture here, if you look carefully at the top row in this matrix, you see random shades between white and black. So white is 1 and 0, black is 0. So the darker the little dash there, the closer to 0 the neuron's value is. The next row down represents visually the values between 0 and 1 of the 10 neurons at the next time step, and so on for 50 time steps. We started with 10 random values, but you'll see something interesting in the pattern of activations here. What's happening? Are you getting a perfectly random scattering of gray dashes? Definitely not. It's non-random. How is it non-random?
Seems to alternate a little bit.
It's alternating, right? So there's some interesting oscillations that are going on. Some of them are actually oscillating at kind of different frequencies than others. They're not all oscillating in the same way. So this is the black magic of artificial neural networks. We created a completely random set of synaptic weights. We set the neurons to random values, and we started to get interesting non-random patterns out of those neurons. We'll talk about the black magic of neural networks more next time. I didn't get a chance to talk about assignment 3. Get started on assignment 2, and we'll talk about assignment 3 at the beginning of class on Thursday. You have a quiz due tonight. Thank you very much.